What are you looking to gain out of tonight? Is there a specific problem that you have on your farm, or are you just looking for like a general overview?
Is there a good forage for silvopasture?
Yes, oh my gosh, I love your question so much. So she asked about silvopasture, which is where we grow forages and livestock under trees that we plan on harvesting. I'm assuming you're planning on harvesting the trees.
Eventually, but some are actually, there's a few fruit trees in there too, but so they won't be shading out too much, but they're in the mix.
Are they hardwoods mostly, or do you have pine?
We don't have pine, it's like a mixed hardwood forest, then like a forest edge, and then like pasture.
One of our dealers in far eastern North Carolina in Burgaw, he has pine silvopasture, and everything I know about silvopasture I've learned from his trial and error. It seems like the most important thing for getting forage to grow is managing that canopy, right? So he recently had to do a pretty intense thinning because he was losing so much forage production because it just wasn't getting enough sunlight. And I'm sure there are like some numbers as to how many trees per like acre you should have. But I think you could eyeball it pretty well. You know, like if it's not getting more than like 6 hours of sunlight in a day, then you probably need to do some kind of thinning. The other challenge that he has is with leaf litter, which I'm sure you would struggle with just during like what, fall usually when they drop?
Yeah, I mean there's persistent leaf litter from what we already have, but it's mostly like we're beginning a silvopasture, so we're transitioning from pasture to a mid-succession stage.
In Goldsboro, at one of the research stations that NC State works with, they did just that. They took an area, they planted trees into an existing pasture, and they were looking at like different kinds of trees and that kind of thing. I think the most important thing from a tree longevity standpoint, which is what you'd be most worried about early on, would be to make sure that the livestock don't get access to those trees when they're too young. For pines, the rule of thumb is 5 years. I would have to double check to see on your deciduous trees how long you would need to not let the cattle have access to the trees themselves. But one thing he found for managing the litter itself, it was hard to keep perennial grasses under the trees because the litter was so difficult to manage because you couldn't burn. In his case, he didn't have a good way to like rake the litter off. Maybe you would have a better opportunity to do that. But he has since moved to like an annual rotation where he'll keep like crabgrass in the summer and ryegrass in the fall, or something like sorghum sudan, which does surprisingly well under the trees, and then using some other type of winter annual. What trees are you planning on planting?
We have mulberries and also a bunch of like gold rush apples and hazelnuts and alder and willows.
Well, that'll be nice. You won't have to worry about shade much during the summer. Why do we care so much about forages in the livestock industry? Why is it something we're constantly having to educate ourselves on? There's a long list of reasons why. I think the one that resonates best with producers is dollars and cents. This was a study done to calculate figures about what it would cost to keep a 100 cow herd fed for 130 days through the winter. And the way that they fed them varied. They either gave them hay for 130 days, which meant that it cost them $170 per cow for those 130 days. They grazed corn residue, which we probably don't have as good an opportunity to do that here because of how wet our winters are, but there's a small window where we could graze corn residue. They grazed 60 days of corn residue and then fed hay for 70. That knocked $50 off the overwintering cost just by grazing during those 60 days. They grazed stockpiled tall fescue, which we've talked about pretty extensively already, and I hope this iterates how important fescue is to our operations. They got 90 days of grazing and then had to feed hay for 40, which I think is a very achievable goal for this region. And it cost them $70 to carry a cow through that period. So you knocked $100 off just by having that stockpiled fescue to graze for 90 days. And then we look at a clean-tilled ryegrass and rye, so those are two annuals blended together. It was a little bit more expensive because you've got some annual seed costs to that, but they were able to bring that $172 wintering cost to $108.
Do you know when they planted that cool season annual?
This was Jim Garish, so this was probably in the Midwest somewhere. So they're probably planting more in like the August time frame, maybe early September. For us, we're going to want to push that back a little bit and think about kind of the month of September being prime for our planting time. At the end of the day, why exactly does this matter? We don't control the market, we can control our expenses. So if we can improve our overall profitability by reducing the expenses that we've got, man, that sounds like a perfect world, doesn't it? We can do that here. Yeah.
How's the corn do? That cold residue corn? Mm-hmm. So is that, pardon my ignorance, is that sweet corn that they just took the ears and left the stalks and they put the cattle in there?
You could do that. This was probably more focused on corn that was raised for livestock feeding. So when you harvest corn, it depends on the settings on the combine, but usually you can count on 5% of the yield getting kicked back out the combine. So I don't know if y'all see this very often, but I know back east we have a little bit longer of a fall. You'll get corn that sprouts from those seeds. So they're talking about grazing that corn stubble, so the stalk that was left behind by the combine and the leaf husk, the cob itself that was kind of trashed on the ground.
In the field.
In the field.
Right, not like silage.
No, not silage. No, this is the residue left behind after harvesting. Yeah. Which again, I don't think we could do that for 60 days here, but we could probably do it for 30 days. And then I have one producer who grazes corn residue, and before he puts the cattle in an area, he broadcasts ryegrass. So they're eating the corn residue and stomping that ryegrass in. So that would be kind of combining the corn residue in the annual forages system. We can do some pretty cool stuff. We certainly have our challenges with livestock production in the South, but we really could graze 365 days a year. Maybe not every year. Like last winter, we definitely didn't have that opportunity. But we have the best chance of anybody in the country, so I think that's pretty exciting. We talked already about the base forage for this region. I don't expect y'all to have any Bermuda grass except by accident, but Kentucky 31 is definitely going to be the base forage for this region. And we talked already about why it's important for us and where we should certainly be utilizing it, but also why it probably shouldn't be the only forage we have. Cool season forages are going to follow this green diagram right here. So what happens to us if we only have fescue, if we only have a cool season perennial grass? We're going to have a little bit of trouble at some point during the summer. The last 2 summers, we've been in pretty good shape where we've had so much rainfall and a little bit cooler weather, so we might not have had a very dramatic dip here. But certainly during our more traditional type summers, the fescue, being a cool season grass, isn't going to do so hot when it's 95 degrees outside with 90% humidity, right? So we've got to consider having a diversity of forages across our farm. Not just diversity within one pasture, but across the farm as a whole. So how exactly do we do that? First, we've got to understand the growth curves of forages relative to each other, and I'm confident that y'all can do that. You know when warm season grasses come in strong, you know when cool season grasses come in strong. Again, we talked about how important diversity is to us. One that nobody likes to talk about, but that I really love talking to folks about, is having the appropriate stocking rate for your farm. If you are overstocked, your opportunity for having good balanced growth and good forage production is limited. The more severe your stocking rate, the more severe issues you're going to have with your pastures. Managing your grazing, utilizing strip grazing or rotational grazing, is also going to be a huge key to achieving this balanced growth throughout the year. And again, this is going to reduce our dependency on stored forage and supplements, and therefore increases our potential for profitability. Understanding the growth curves of the forages relative to each other, and then talking about specific species that we could introduce. So again, cool season perennial grasses, we're going to get that spring and fall forage. I'll put a little asterisk there and say that fescue, if we stockpile, we can count on winter grazing. Now that's maybe not as simple as it sounds, because what did I have to do to effectively stockpile something?
Leave it alone while it's growing.
Right, so I'm going to leave this fescue alone while it's growing in the fall. so I can graze it in the winter. So what that means is whatever acreage I've decided I'm going to stockpile is unavailable to me in the fall. So that's something I really want to make sure to iterate, is just because we say we're going to stockpile grass doesn't mean that you can use it in the fall, because you're going to save that acreage in the fall for grazing in the winter. So we've got to make sure that we have enough fall pasture to get through fall while still stockpiling. Some folks that may be pushing the limit on their stocking rate have actually started feeding hay in the fall while they allow their fescue to stockpile. The reason they do this is honestly simply for comfort, because it's a lot less fun to feed hay when it's 12 degrees outside or when it's snowing. The tractor also doesn't tend to crank as well in January as it does in September. So some folks have started doing that. Again, the better option is probably going to be to have enough acreage that we can count on growth in the fall and leaving some to grow later in the winter.
It seems like it'd be an advantage too to be getting the hay when it's more abundant, when people want to be moving because they don't want to store it. And we haven't known that it was a wicked cold winter and there isn't as much hay around. Mm-hmm. So you don't have to worry about it because you got stockpiled in cold weather and you fed the hay when nobody knew what was coming.
The challenge with cool season perennial grasses, or just kind of their natural behavior, is they're going to experience some kind of summer slump. One thing that we have seen, let's think back to that year where we had such a bad drought. We were experiencing a drought, our plants were very stressed, we weren't sure when our next rainfall was going to come. If we continued to manage and graze our cool season perennial pastures like we normally would, we would end up with a lot of weed invasion, right? Some very common ones. This one's becoming a pretty big problem. This is foxtail and Johnson grass, which really tends to be more of an issue in our hay fields than it does our pastures because it's very palatable, so they'll get rid of it pretty quick for us. But think about fescue as not a morning person, right? And if we graze our fescue or our other cool season perennial grasses during the heat of the summer while we're experiencing a drought, we're asking it to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and do a workout. How our foxtail, our horse nettle, our Johnson grass, in the summer, they're morning people, right? You graze them when they're under stress, and they're just going to power through that 5 a.m. workout. So think about managing stress during the summer for our cool season perennial grasses. This summer, we really haven't been very challenged with that. We've had pretty good rainfall and pretty mild temperatures for the most part. So our cool season grasses have maintained their growth pretty well. But if we tend to experience droughts during the summer, like July and August, think about getting off that fescue and getting onto a grass that's better adapted for that time frame and for those weather conditions. Because otherwise, you could be providing the advantage to the weeds that you don't want, okay? Ways that we can help ourselves further. So we talked already about timing of grazing and timing of mowing. Fertility management can actually impact what we see in our pasture pretty greatly. So if we fertilize our fescue in July, do you think that the fescue is going to utilize that forage best? Or do you think our warm season annual weeds are going to utilize that fertility best? It's going to be the weeds, right? So back that fertility up, try and get that fertilized out to that fescue in April or May when it's really growing strong and needs those nutrients. So the timing of your fertility can affect change on the composition of your pasture. And maybe you use that to your advantage sometime, right? So cool season perennial grasses, these are some unique forages that aren't as common as fescue. Orchard grass we talked about already. It is more of a spring producer than it is in the fall, pretty similar to how fescue produces. One that is pretty fun, that's very unique, is Fesculolium. And Fesculolium is a cross between fescues and ryegrasses. The way that they illustrate that so that you and I can understand it is this diamond, okay? So this represents tall fescue. This represents meadow fescue, which grows well up north. This represents perennial ryegrass, and this represents annual ryegrass. And these red dots are all the varieties available and where they fall between each of these forages, each of those species. So in our region, meadow fescue doesn't produce well for us, and perennial ryegrass doesn't perenniate. So we want to focus on varieties that lean heavy towards this tall fescue node here. Boytan is one that we've had the most success with. It's a fun forage. It has some stockpiling potential, not as heavy as what you'll see out of a true fescue, but some. It's going to be higher quality than fescue, and probably more important to us is that it's very palatable. We have a 5 species, 7 location demonstration plot in the Piedmont of the state. And they did, it's a variety trial, but they also wanted to test grazing preference. And they found that Festuloleum is what the livestock went to first. So I think that's really unique. And again, another tool that we can use to increase the amount of forage that our animals consume. It doesn't tiller as aggressively as fescue, which makes it pretty great for putting in blends or mixes, maybe with clovers or with other grasses like orchard grass. Have any of you guys ever seen Festuloleum before? It's very unique, but I think it's one that has a lot of potential and is really fun. Brome grass is another one that I see coming in native if there's good grazing management, but that also deserves our attention. So brome grass, matua is a pretty old variety. You guys may have heard of matua grass or rescue grass. Brome grass is a perennial forage. The plants themselves only live about 2 or 3 years old, but if you let that brome grass seed each year, the stands can persist for like 20 or 25 years. They do tend to be a little bit prone to diseases. So with matua, especially powdery mildew is a pretty big issue, which comes in if we have really wet conditions and there's a lot of forage out there. So definitely not one we utilize for stockpiling. And it actually is very sensitive to having a good rest period. So that's the reason you see it start to come in pastures where they have good grazing management and good rotational grazing, because the brome grass can actually survive those conditions. Warren Wilson College utilizes brome grass a good bit. Why exactly do we care about it? It sounds like kind of a complicated grass. I went to a workshop several years ago, and they had a bucket of seeded out brome grass hay. And then they had a bucket of vegetative fescue hay with the quality samples in front of each of them. And I'm like, I got this, right? The fescue is obviously going to be higher quality because it's not seeded out. We know that vegetative grasses are more digestible than our seeded out grasses. And even though it had seeded out, the brome grass was higher in crude protein and in TDN, that digestible energy, than the vegetative fescue. So this stuff, I always call it rocket fuel. And I think it's a really fun grass that, again, we can use as a tool for spring and fall grazing, just with a couple of management quirks to it. We've talked already pretty extensively about tall fescue, so I'm going to breeze over these. One thing I just want you guys to make sure that you understand, sometimes we make these things a little bit too complicated, but endophyte-free grasses do not contain the fungus. Expect a little bit less longevity, more like orchard grass, 4, 5, 7 years or so, whereas novel endophyte fescues have the fungus present, but it doesn't produce the toxin. And when managed properly, meaning that we don't have overgrazing, you can expect them to last as long as Kentucky 31. My absolute favorite forages are winter annual grasses. I think the reason that I like them so much is because we can stage the growth of these forages to very specifically when you need them. Okay, so like if I planted millet and Sudan grass, their growth and when they would be harvestable would vary a little bit, but what really determines when we get the growth out of those is rainfall. If we think about these winter annual grasses, their most limiting factor in the winter, because we usually have an abundance of rainfall, is actually temperature. So how cold tolerant these varieties are and how fast or how quickly growing they are determines when we get to harvest that forage. Timing of planting is critical, especially if we're trying to accomplish this stage. The month of September is going to be best for us in this area. If we're blessed with a mild fall, you can get into the first couple of weeks of October, especially if you focus on the more cold tolerant winter annuals. Let's say you came to me and you said, I really struggle with fall grazing. That like November, December timeframe is something that's really, really tough for me. Spring oats are going to be the answer to that. The name is a little bit misleading, but spring oats can be planted in the fall, or they can be planted in like late winter. And within 45 to 60 days, you will have 8 to 12 inches of growth out there. It is incredible. I'll be utilizing spring oats this fall for the first time, I should say. We're keeping a herd of stocker calves to graze our cover crops across the farm. And I need something to graze in late October, November, December. And so I'm going to utilize spring oats for that time period. This picture was taken in Winston-Salem at a farm, and this was, I think, like 60 days after planting. Now, obviously, the success of this is dependent on rainfall. If we get no rainfall after planting, nothing's going to happen. But with our regular rain patterns, this is what you can get. So they're a lot of fun. There's always a but.
Years ago, talking to Greg Hoyt, who used to be our cover crop expert at the research station, he said, Pat, it seems that when you want oats to live in the mountains, they die, and when you don't want them to live, they live. And so do you think that it's a little bit iffier for us here that cold might kill them before they...
Yes, 100%. And that was going to be my caveat to spring oats. I do not plant spring oats by themselves in the fall. 8 years out of 10, they will winter kill. This year that happened in January. Last year it happened in February. Some years they'll make a liar out of you and they'll survive, but a true spring oat, I would not count on having forage for the remainder of the spring. So you always need to pair it with something that's actually going to survive the winter. So what exactly could those be? Cereal rye is a very common small grain. I do like cereal rye, and if you graze it at the right time, it's very high quality. My only issue with it is that it seeds out pretty quick. So once we start getting into like February, March, it's going to be trying to put out a seed head, and you'll lose some quality out of it. The alternative to cereal rye that a lot of folks are turning to who are going after quality is something called triticale. And triticale is a hybrid cross between wheat and cereal rye. And what you end up with is the leafiness and the tillering of wheat, but production that's closer to cereal rye. From what I've seen, triticale will continue to stay vegetative for like 2 to 3 weeks after cereal rye does. So you think about 2 to 3 weeks, and in the grand scheme of things, you're like, that's not really that much. But if we're thinking about grazing and trying to put weight on animals in the wintertime, 2 to 3 weeks is a big deal. So triticale is a big go-to for me, and that's what I'll be pairing with my spring oats this fall. Now, winter oats, we do have one variety of winter oat, and this oat you can plant in the fall. It won't winter kill unless we get terrible, terrible conditions, and it's productive more into early spring, whereas those spring oats are going to give us that late fall production. Winter oats aren't going to do a whole lot in the fall, and then will come on pretty heavy mid-spring. You guys are probably very familiar with annual ryegrass. This is like the king of winter annuals. Super easy to establish. You can broadcast it. I would definitely recommend drilling or some type of tillage to incorporate these other grains. Ryegrass you can broadcast, and it'll establish pretty well that way. Ryegrass usually doesn't give us heavy production until like that mid to late spring time frame, and then it'll try to persist for a long time into the summer. Usually we can end up with it even into June. It's a great option for us, a fantastic, very high quality, very high biomass producer, but when you're planning your winter annual grazing, just keep in mind that you won't get a lot of that production until that late spring time frame. I mentioned that you can plant spring oats in late winter. So usually for this area, I'd want to wait until like late February, early March, early to mid-March. You can plant spring oats, and then that same 45 to 60 days later, you'll get production, which would put you more to mid-late spring. They're so much fun, you guys. I get really impressed by oats because they have like a super wide leaf, and the base of the stem is really huge as well. So from a cover crop perspective, it does a really good job of like shading out like henbit and chickweed and that kind of thing. Summer annual grasses. We talked about that summer slump that we may experience out of our cool season perennial grasses. Summer annual grasses can be kind of an answer to that question. One caveat to annual grasses that I haven't talked about that I want to make sure to iterate is that summer annual grasses, they know that they have a small amount of time to do everything that they're going to do. So on a per acre basis, your yield out of an annual grass is going to be pretty heavy compared to what a perennial would do during that same time. So if we're thinking about acreage of planting, your annual acreage can actually stay pretty small. If you have a 100-acre farm, maybe on the first year especially, just try 10 or 15 acres and see how that fits into your system. But summer annual grasses can have some strong importance to us. One thing that we see tried fairly often that we rarely see success with is a lot of times folks will want to drill a summer annual grass like millet or sorghum sudan straight into a perennial pasture like fescue because it's out of season, right? But what we've seen is that fescue doesn't go dormant enough during the summer to allow for that summer annual grass to really get established and be productive. So this was a Catawba County demonstration done by the extension agent there, Glenn Detweiler, which you can see right here. He terminated that perennial field. He eliminated the perennial from that area. And here, he did not terminate. So you can see the amount of biomass that you lost just because of the competitiveness of that fescue. And this area right here was actually the best out of the whole field. So that's right here.
Where he didn't terminate?
That's right. Yeah, so where he did not terminate, there was a serious loss in production. So what we encourage people is, I know that we don't want to tear up all of our perennial pasture, but if we're going to commit to keeping annuals in our rotation, you're better off to kill a small area of your perennials, whether that be by tillage or use of herbicides, and do that in a smaller area than to overseed a large acreage of your cool season perennial pasture. And you'll get the same production out of that. So I could either intentionally farm 5 acres, or I could take a risk with 25 acres, have 5 times the input cost and the same yield out of it. Does that make sense? You said, I don't know about that. What's been your experience? Have you?
I don't want to play devil's advocate.
No, I like it. Yeah.
It seems like the diversity on the right, that you're going to get an annual to a perennial forage, that could be beneficial. It may not, as far as yield goes and biomass, I understand that what's on the right is smaller than what's on the left. But at the same time, you're going to increase diversity, and through that, and through if you can do it in a no-till manner, as opposed to, and I'm not calling you out, I know we don't want to, I know you just said we don't want to disc and destroy our pasture, I got you. Mm-hmm. But if we can, if we can drill in some diversity into our established pasture and get some growth out of it, I think it could be pretty beneficial. Mm-hmm. I'm trying it across the street.
The only issue long-term that I see with that is these are not, it's not like synergistic diversity like how our clovers are with our fescue or other cool season bunch grasses. It's like an antagonistic diversity. So like if you had a great stand of sudan grass or sorghum sudan one season, that fall you would see a reduction in the amount of fescue present because that grass like shaded out and killed out some of the fescue. But there is an exception to that though. Yes, sir?
So you guys has an opportunity to go ahead and seed in the better fescue.
Sure, you absolutely could. But then, yes.
You wouldn't get as much gain. You would take a loss on your yield for a winter while that better fescue is getting established. Mm-hmm. But it could be a way to be slowly shifting to the better fescue.
Sure.
Or what if you had a spot that you didn't really like?
It can be used as a strategy to renovate your pasture. And the smothering effect of annuals is actually very commonly regarded. The only thing that you'll sacrifice by using this method is inconsistency in success. So like if we had a really droughty summer and you had seeded a perennial into it, that fescue is going to be better at absorbing what little moisture you do get, so you wouldn't get much smothering effect that year. A year like this, where y'all have been having very consistent heavy rainfalls, you might get something closer to this and then take you closer to your goal of thinning out that fescue stand. As long as you have a realistic expectation of what's going to happen in that pasture, you're not really messing yourself up.
And a willingness to be okay if it does the opposite.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
And as you were talking about how the fescue doesn't do well in the summer, I was thinking of some of the weedier places out here and thinking that's a place to sow Sudex, to kind of like get something that competes with those weeds, and then when they graze, the weeds don't have a head start, and indeed the Sudex will come back. And so you're still kind of beating up on the weeds, and then the fescue, you come in and you seed the preferred fescue in the fall.
That's right. That's right. As long as you understand that you've, I guess, inherited more risk by the way that you sowed it, then it's all good. Now, my one caveat to this that I'm sure y'all see pretty frequently just native is crabgrass. Crabgrass has gained a lot of popularity the last few years because it kind of feels like a silver bullet. Because crabgrass, its growth habit is a lot more similar to what our perennial grasses exude, right? So like crabgrass, you're going to see it get 10 to 12 inches tall, maybe 16 inches tall, and that's going to be as big as it gets. Sorghum stan, I've seen 18 feet tall before. So because of that, and because it has like a weed background, I guess you could say, crabgrass does very well when interseeded into thin stands of perennial grass. And you've probably seen it before, like if you had a droughtier year or a warmer year, crabgrass, native crabgrass comes in pretty heavy anyway. And we hear a lot of producers say, yeah, crabgrass saved me. Because it natively came in at a time where, you know, the cool season perennial grasses weren't doing so well. So that's my exception to that rule. Now, crabgrass does come with its own set of establishment challenges because the seed is tiny. And getting good seed to soil contact and that pressure, getting that seed pushed into the soil is a little harder. But certainly something to get excited about. Have y'all met Deidre yet, Dr. Harmon? She's the new livestock and forages specialist out of Waynesville. She has a crabgrass variety trial planted at the research station. So if you get some free time, I would definitely recommend going and checking it out. It's very fun to look at. Broadleaf crops, so this would include our legumes and our forbs. We talked about some of the perennials, and I want to talk to you guys about some of the annual options as well, just because I think they're a lot of fun. Turnips, radishes, and hybrid brassicas. So this is a picture here of barcant turnip, which is a very leafy turnip that has fairly decent regrowth, but also has that tuber to it. So we talked already about how important those taproots can be to us during times of drought. And how good they make those plants at scavenging for nutrients. But we also have to think about how that tuber is impacting the soil. So if we had an area that was pretty heavy in compaction or that was really low in organic matter, do you think that tuber would help us at all? Heck yeah, it would, right? The majority of these brassicas are also going to winter kill around the time that those spring oats will. Rapeseed is the exception. Rapeseed has very good cold tolerance. There is a boatload of annual clovers. Probably the most prevalent is crimson, which has that beautiful true red flower to it. It tends to reseed very well, although that's not going to help you get the best forage quality, but could help you a little bit from a sustainability perspective. Vetch, you may see a lot of common vetch coming into your pastures. Hairy vetch is also another variety within vetch that you could seed. These clovers, crimson especially, tend to pair best with like a cereal grain, like your rye, triticale, wheat, barley. Vetch I see pairing better with ryegrass as far as timing of when it grows most aggressively. Vetch is much later in the spring, but vetch is regarded as being the highest nitrogen-fixing legume, annual legume, and that's simply biomass related. If you let it go all spring, it gets huge. It actually gets to be a little bit frustrating because if you're like walking through your pastures to put up fence or something, I always trip over the vines, so it's a little aggravating, but a lot of fun and a great option for us. Peas, Austrian winter pea is the most prevalent. We also have some spring peas, and those would follow the same rules as far as planting, timing, and forage production as a spring oat. So you could plant them in the fall, they're probably going to winter kill, or you could plant them in that late winter time frame and then get production out of them in that mid-spring time frame. Warm season annual wise, cowpeas and sun hemp are really the most prevalent. You actually can also grow brassicas during the summer. I know that surprises some folks, but especially under a canopy of grass like millet or Sudan grass, brassicas do very well during the summer. One warm season annual legume that I always run across that I haven't been impressed with yet is like a forage soybean. We've tried them in mixtures, and some folks will plant them like for their deer plots. I haven't seen them do as well as I've seen sun hemp and cowpea do. So those are still my two go-to warm season annual legume options. What I want to stress to you, how do you use this overload of information? Create a forage plan. And I have an example here. I don't want you guys to use this though because it's not for your farm. I want you to think about your farm, and I want to think about when you lack grazing the most and work from there. Let's say that you lack grazing the most in that January, February time frame. Consider stockpiling some fescue. Consider planting some winter annuals that can really have some forage production during that time frame. Add diversity across your farm and within each pasture. We've already seen how great diversity is within a field and how that hedges us better against poor weather conditions and that type of thing. But we also need to have diversity across the farm as far as actual forages. Keep some acreage in annuals to complement that perennial production. Also help you get some higher quality forages out there. And I would be remiss if I didn't tell you to remember the most critical piece of this puzzle, which is your grazing management. If you do not manage your forages well, you could throw thousands of dollars in seed, thousands of dollars in fertilizer, and you'll never get the productivity and honestly just the beauty of having this long season grazing. Nothing will thrive if you don't manage it well. Remember to respect those grazing heights for each plant, so that means start and stop. Okay, so for fescue in particular, we want to leave behind about 3 inches of stubble, and we don't want to go back to that plant until it's at least 8 inches. Think about that timely fertilization and grazing. Remember we talked about competition and fescue not being a morning person in the summer. Use that to your advantage. I stole this cartoon from a turf grass company, but I think this image holds true into our livestock plans. So if we let our forages remain tall, and again, respect those grazing heights, we can choke out weeds that may be toxic to our livestock or may not be helping them gain weight. If we overgraze our pastures and poorly manage them, the weeds are going to be having a party. There's a producer that lives just down the road in Clyde, North Carolina, Tim Kelly. He was doing a presentation this past year at the North Carolina Forage and Grasslands Council meetings, and he was talking about his transition from continuous grazing to strip grazing. And he said his word of advice to everyone was, don't let your pastures look like the Jenny Craig diet. Make sure that we keep those pastures lush and full, that we're not grazing something that looks like this. So with that, I'm very excited to hear any more questions you guys have got.
Just other strategies for impacting weeds, like we have a miscanthus infection. You know, do you have any strategies as far as what you might seed in besides what you have, how high you'd graze it if the other what's supposed to be competing with it is fescue?
And I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on where this miscanthus came from the get-go. But you kind of have to take it on you can't overgeneralize for all weeds what will work. I think a good strategy for that miscanthus, just because it grows so tall, is to utilize mowing. You know, the answer is, especially with weeds, is not always seeding. Sometimes it's just how can we alter our management in small ways. So I would first give it a go and see if I could just bush hog the living daylights out of it and see if that would get it gone. That would work for any plant that grows that much taller than your traditional canopy height. Now that would not work for something like the horse nettle that you've got out there. Interestingly enough, there's been some discussion between universities about how one thing you've got to accept as you improve your grazing management and as you utilize strip grazing is that more weeds are going to come in, because not only are you giving your grasses good rest periods, you're giving your weeds good rest periods too. I think we could try mowing for miscanthus, but for our lower growing weeds like that foxtail I talked about, the horse nettle, I don't know. I don't know how we could manage them without some kind of herbicide input, or maybe if it got bad enough, we could utilize some type of tillage and then start over with an aggressively growing cover crop that could try to smother it out. But those perennial weeds are tough.
In the miscanthus tricky, I think. There was always some here, and there was like a patch like down the hill there.
Was it originally like what do you call it? Ornamental?
A lot of it came in back there was a severe drought in '87, and the Midwestern farmers brought hay to everybody here. And so they brought it in. Yeah, it came in. It came in as an act of kindness. Yeah, well, I mean, those farmers would have gone out of business probably without that hay.
Yeah.
Or really been hurt really bad. It was a 2-year wicked drought like 2016 was. It was like 2 years of that. And so it just wasn't hay for animals, and the Midwest was doing fine, so they just, and I'm sure they didn't ship their prime hay in, I'm sure they shipped their weedier hay in, which people were glad to have, but I think most people that have been around long enough would agree that that's where we got it started, and now it's along the roads and all over the place, so it comes in,
That's interesting.
One of the strategies that we've tried and are trying and so on and so forth is this idea of stockpiling. We've done this in the past to where we'll graze X amount and we'll do it at high density, so it's pretty non-selective, and then we keep them whatever space that is, whatever time frame it is. So that space and that time is maintained throughout the growing season. Whenever the spot that we started at has more or less peak biomass and that everything's looking even and full, but it's not flowering yet, we bring them back to it. Okay, so and then that's kind of our pattern through the summer. And obviously it's going to fluctuate. And maybe it's 40 days, maybe it's 60 days, maybe it's 70, so on and so forth. But whatever we didn't get to, we totally leave alone all summer. And then we actively graze that area until we can do it no more. So then it starts to cool off, frost comes, and then we do that high density, non-selective grazing, and it doesn't recover as quickly. So then we get into our stockpile, and whatever that stuff was that was growing all year long. And then what we do is the year after that is be sure and switch those two spots. So we get this really great recovery and growth and full growth and reseeding out of this section, while this section is getting actively grazed. But it's kind of like what you just said, and it's something that's got me thinking in the past of why that, with all this diversity, what species are going, what is the difference that species are going to react to that style of management? What's going to benefit and profit and what isn't, and how that comes into play in the diversity of a given season, blah, blah, blah. But it's what you said, you got to take the good with the bad when you do that, because I'm sitting there watching all this other stuff that I kind of don't want, really coming to its own as well. And it's totally outnumbered. It's not like half the farm is full of weeds.
Sure.
But I think something we're trying to do now is actively graze the whole farm as best we can throughout the whole growing season. And then right about now, hold off on portions set aside for winter and for stockpile. And And I see what you're saying. It's a great point, is to be able to have some space there for animals to get, and if you can get your timing right and put them right in there and get them right out when you wanted to. I mean, 2 or 3 weeks, 4 weeks of grazing in like December, January, February is huge. It's huge. But anyway, and then that gets into stocking rate too. And like we were saying out there, like if you got your stocking rate right, where everything's clicking along and you hit this like sweet spot of what your farm can produce, given your management style, you know, in synergy with the amount of animals you have, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
And the struggle there, right, is that your effective stocking rate changes throughout the year. And I think a lot of livestock producers will stock their farm for when they have the most forage. And then the rest of the year, they're like, feeding hay. So then it raises the question, well, what should our stocking rate be? Should we always stock for our lowest forage productivity? Should we be somewhere in average? Certainly we've seen that stocking at the top of your forage peak is not a good long-term strategy, but it's tough.
It's been really, that has been difficult for me.
Because it changes on the year.
It changes all the year and everything changes, but it gets a little better. But it's like we were saying outside, it's August and you're like, oh man, I got all this grass, I didn't utilize my grass, oh God. And then February comes and it's like, oh my God, there's no grass, oh my God, I gotta buy hay, blah, blah, blah. And I know there's a sweet spot in there, but I haven't quite figured it out yet.
Well, and it's a changing sweet spot because every year is different.
Yeah.
Aren't you so excited to get this farm going? She's sitting here like, maybe I should just sell it.
I was hoping maybe you had some words of hope for ruined horse pasture. That's all.
Yeah, like we were talking about earlier, the great thing about horse pasture is, although it has been overgrazed and there's probably a lot of undesirable grasses and some pretty good weed pressure, your fertility there is going to be awesome because so much has had to be brought in for them, right? So like hay's been brought in, they've been fed other types of supplements. A lot of producers and farmers are more challenged on the soil fertility side of things. So as long as you can get a good crop started, then you're going to be pretty well set. Because what you're going to be faced with is, one, getting rid of the undesirable forages that are there, and two, preventing that weed seed bed from having the opportunity to really jump and take over. In pasture transitions, I really like utilizing annuals because of how quick they are. Perennials, we've got a baby to a greater extent, and they're also slower during their establishment year, whereas annuals, like we talked about, they know they have a short amount of time, so they really, I guess, put the pedal to the metal once they get in the ground. Perennials are in it for the long haul, so they'll sit and wait for the right conditions to come along. So utilize, take off small bites. Don't overwhelm yourself and try to do the whole thing in one day. I think as farmers and as goal setters, we tend to maybe over-expect from ourselves or create too lofty a goals in a short time frame. So just be kind to yourself, take small bites, and your situation is always going to be better than someone else's. So somebody has it worse. You can do it. Yeah, you can do it. And it's so much fun. I mean, there's a reason that they're here and that they're operating this educational farm, because this stuff, when you've got like that farming sickness or whatever that I talked about earlier, there's just something about going out and seeing lush forage and letting your livestock onto a new section of grass. Like the farming lifestyle, it's a challenging one, but there's a reason that so many of us do it, even though it's not the most glamorous thing in the world.
Would it make any sense at all if you were going to sow summer annuals to either right before or as you were sowing it to also sow something like orchard grass and the better fescues, so that they were kind of getting established, so when the annuals are gone, they could be coming right in?
Yeah, so you're asking specifically with summer annuals?
I'm thinking if summer annuals is a solution to to smothering some of the weeds, you know, and giving us that grazing. And that sometimes we get, like in hot years, we'll get, you know, less production. We're cooler and wetter, so it's not as big a problem, but it just seems like summer annuals are something you're thinking about doing, right?
Yes.
Unless it was a very late seeded summer annual, I wouldn't pair them together. So what you could do is come like September 1st, you could plant something, what would we want to do? Probably something like Sudan grass at like a quarter rate, something very low, with a perennial. And then what would happen is your summer annual would get maybe that tall, and then the frost would kill it out. So you could do that. More commonly, the nurse crop, we call that nurse crop, and the nurse crop that's used is another winter annual. So like they'll plant wheat or barley or spring oats at a very low rate with that perennial. And I guess most of the time the reason for it is to like kind of canopy over that perennial and kind of save it from extra cold or even extra heat. You could do a summer annual, but only if it was late planted. So yes.
So you would never graze that summer annual, it would just be a nurse crop.
Yes, and the reason why is because we want to protect that perennial. Most oftentimes, they're not going to actually graze that perennial because it would be so short at that time, but it is a pretty sensitive little seedling. So we want to minimize hoof traffic on it until that perennial has gotten to the appropriate height, which would be like 8 inches or so.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you guys for coming. That was a lot of fun.